There are a lot of movie cars, but it's hard to imagine one that's more recognizable than the Back to the Future DeLorean.
The most fantastic, flashy, four-wheel time machine in the history of movies.
I think it's the most important movie car, period. It's perfect.
It's not just a sci-fi movie, it's not an action-adventure. It's just all those elements combined so beautifully, almost like a gourmet Parisian meal or something. But of course, the car was the main dish.
Are you telling me that you built a time machine out of a DeLorean?
When the DeLorean car first rolled out of the factory in Ireland last year, much of America was rooting for its success. Ironically, it is now, during DeLorean's nightmare, that his dream may finally come true.
The mystique around the DeLorean brand only makes people want to know more.
DeLorean was synonymous with success. He was this handsome, rich, successful man married to the hottest supermodel at the time. He was the epitome of what every guy wanted to be and who every girl wanted to be with. He knew what people wanted, and he was a marketing genius.
It was pure courage, pure nerve that guy had.
Former General Motors executive John DeLorean had thumbed his nose at the big automakers, saying he'd show the industry how to build cars.
As a lot of the commercials said at the time, the most anticipated new car of the century, and I believe it was.
The car stimulated so much of the imagination, so it's woven into the fabric of our society.
As they said in the film, Back to the Future, where we're going, we don't need roads.
You've got the filmmaking aspect, the creative aspect, you have the history of the car, you have the man himself, John DeLorean. All that stuff combines into this big thing.
It's almost like a nostalgic connection with all of these characters, you know.
The DeLorean time machine is part and parcel of the fabric of pop culture.
I have to say that isn't the real star of the film the car?
Well, yeah, but you don't have to tell me that.
Falling in love with a movie like this and then seeing it come to life in front of your eyes, you can't put a price tag on it.
I must have signed 500,000 of these.
Our memories take us back in time, and our hopes and dreams and imagination takes us forward. And you'd be hard-pressed to find another car that can do that.
When this baby hits 88 miles per hour, you're gonna see some serious shit.
When I was a little kid in grade school, I used to tell people, when I grow up, I'm gonna go out to California and work for Walt Disney. Comic books and science fiction were huge influences on warping my brain. Twilight Zone was my favorite TV show, and of course, seeing the time machine really kind of blew my head apart.
Thousands of centuries had passed. Man finally learned to control both the elements and himself. I had to stop and find out.
I was always writing science fiction stories, and I even made my own comic book when I was in high school. It was called The Green Vomit, and it was about a superhero who had the superpower able to throw up at will on anybody, on bad guys. And his arch nemesis was Super Snot, who could do the same thing with his nose. California was the place to be, because that's where Hollywood was. And I transferred to USC. A year later, I met Bob Zemeckis in 1971, and we became fast friends. He wanted to be a director, I wanted to be a screenwriter. We were both undergraduates in what was largely a graduate department. We decided that we should team up and figure out how to get in the movie business. We were more interested in Dirty Harry and James Bond, and the graduate students were more interested in Francois Truffaut and Jean-Luc Godard.
Selon le communiqué du secrétariat à l'information.
We want to do larger-than-life stuff, and maybe we can blow some stuff up. We want to entertain people. I mean, this is what got us excited when we were going to the movies, so we wanted to make the kind of movies that we wanted to see. So we came up with this very rudimentary idea called Professor Brown Visits the Future. That's all we had, the idea that there would be this kind of wacky professor who invents time travel, but we were never able to really figure out how there was going to be a story, what was going to keep the audience interested. So we would, every once in a while, we would return to that and never get anywhere. Cut to August 1980, Bob Zemeckis and I made a movie at Columbia Pictures called Used Cars. I went to St. Louis, my hometown, to promote it, the Hometown Boy Does Good story. I was staying with my parents, and I found my father's high school yearbook. I said, oh, this looks interesting. It could be cool to see what my high school looked like in 1940. And I'm paging through it, and I discovered that my dad was the president of his graduating class. So I'm looking at this picture of my dad, and I'm thinking about the president of my graduating class, who was this rah-rah school spirit guy. Couldn't stand the guy. And I thought, gee, was that the kind of guy my dad was? If I had gone to high school with my dad, would I have even been friends with him? Boy, bingo, that's when the lightning bolt struck me in the head, and I said, there's that time travel movie that we always wanted to do. That's the hook. A kid goes back in time and ends up in high school with his dad. So when I come back to California, I immediately go over to Bob Zemeckis' apartment, and we just started rolling on this thing. We wrote 2 drafts of Back to the Future at Columbia Pictures, and Columbia decided that they did not want to make the movie. So it was too nice, and it was too sweet. They wanted stripes, they wanted Porkies, they wanted something raunchier. We took this project around to everybody in Hollywood, over and over and over again sometimes, to the tune of over 40 rejections. So finally, the thing that gets Back to the Future made is that Bob Zemeckis makes a hit movie called Romancing the Stone. Everybody and his uncle wants to be in business with Bob Zemeckis. And the movie that Bob wants to make most of all is Back to the Future. Now let's rewind a couple years. Steven Spielberg had read Back to the Future. We gave it to Steven because we'd been in business with Steven. We made all 3 of our first movies with Steven. So now Bob Zemeckis has this hit movie, Romancing the Stone, and he says, I don't want to be in business with any of my new fair weather friends. I want to be in business with somebody who always believed in this project. And fortuitously, Steven was just then setting up Amblin Entertainment at Universal. So Back to the Future became the very first Amblin Entertainment project. Now the second draft of the script was not the movie that we actually ended up making. We made lots of changes, which is to be expected, not the least of which was the time machine in the first 2 drafts was a time chamber built out of a refrigerator. Obviously, one of the questions that you have in a time travel movie is, how does somebody travel through time? You know, you can do it by getting hit on the head. You can do it by making a wish.
That's what I'd like to do with the year I've just lived. Rewrite it, play it over again.
But we grew up in the 50s and the 60s with the shadow of Sputnik, and we believed that to make the audience believe in time travel, there had to actually be a physical time machine. That became a given. It was at some point in the writing of this next draft, Bob was putting his director hat on instead of just his writer's hat. He came into the office and he said, hey, Bob, wouldn't Doc have been smart enough to have built the time machine into a car so that it was mobile? I said, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
If you in fact were to build a time machine, it became very apparent that you'd be foolish not to make it mobile and to take it with you so that you could get back.
And then he came up with the most brilliant idea. And what if that car was a DeLorean? I said, oh yeah, oh yeah. Well, it so happened that this was in August of 1984, and John DeLorean was on trial. He was sort of notorious. I mean, this was on the news every day in August. And so that was what made the DeLorean an even cooler car than it already was. Not only does it have these gull-wing doors, but it just gave the car this great mystique.
So, I mean, before you can actually have a Back to the Future DeLorean time machine, you have to have a DeLorean to begin with.
Most of us know very little about how John DeLorean came to power and became such an infamous public figure as he is today.
John came to GM in the late 50s, early 60s. One of the things he did early on was take the pulse of the society at that point. He would go onto Woodward Street in Detroit there and saw the hot rodders testing out cars and doing all these fun things. Between him and Bill Collins, another engineer there, they decided to drop a large engine and a smaller frame car and called it the GTO. They sort of backdoored it into the GM world, and it became a huge hit. GM didn't really realize it. They were sort of pissed at first, but it did such blockbuster sales that it really set the mark for the types of things that John could do there.
The GTO and other high-performance muscle cars made John DeLorean an auto industry star in the mid-1960s.
Fast forward several years, he's vice president of General Motors, on track to be the next president if he plays his cards right, which, to the detriment of GM, was really not the place that he was going to excel, because at that point he was more of a paper pusher up on the 14th floor and less on the ground doing the engineering and sort of idea stuff with the people at these other divisions.
You get to a point where you can't be an engineer anymore. If you want to be promoted, you have to be something else, and you become a so-called manager. So it was an intense competitive game, and you were like the quarterback of a team. Well, then suddenly when you become a group executive, it was pretty much like owning a stadium, and all of a sudden you're renting out the facilities, but you really don't have much to say about what goes on in them. And a funny thing happens to you in any organization when you slowly get to the top. The first thing you know, you're surrounded by a bunch of sort of hangers-on and yes men. It doesn't take very much for that to turn you into an egomaniac.
You can see his success as a business person within GM and his conversion into this sort of young, sexy playboy character at about the same time. He's doing a little bit of plastic surgery, getting a chin implant, he's got the sideburns, he's dressing in the Italian suits that the GM brass aren't super excited about, but definitely set him apart in the mainstream world.
He kept himself fit. He loved having the Hollywood lifestyle. He liked just being known for who he was.
John would spend a lot of time in California with a lot of his Hollywood friends to sort of be inspired by things. He would, offer cars to various actors to drive or to be used in productions. GM would get pissed off about this, but they wouldn't realize that that was really what was driving sales. He wasn't just a showman. He actually was a brilliant engineer. He's got 2 or 3 dozen patents to his name. The Pontiac GTO stands out based on the fact that that set the course for the muscle car era. He met sales that have never been beaten before, and he would do that through talking with his fellow engineers, the people on the lines making the cars. So he was a real people person.
I think he felt like he was being restrictive of what he could do, and I think he had bigger dreams. He definitely had an eye on what the public wanted. He proved it working at GM, and now GM wasn't letting him do the other things he wanted to do.
Your resignation was drawn by General Motors. Is that unusual for a man who intends to resign? Was it a resignation, or were you in fact asked to leave?
No, I left. I tendered my resignation almost immediately after I was promoted and given a tremendous bonus. I moved up from the head of Chevrolet to the group executive of North American car and truck operations. And I did that about a month, spending every minute and sitting in a committee meeting, listening to the same people say the same things. And I said, I just can't imagine doing this for 18 more years. I couldn't possibly survive.
There's a lot of controversy as to whether he was let go and fired from GM or if he resigned on his own accord. To set the record straight, he was pushed out. But it really set the course for the bigger and better things that everyone knows him for, which is the DMC-12. From the time that John was pushed out of GM, that was in 1973, he spends a year or two sort of raising capital, figuring out ways to design his own sports car. So something that John was trying to do, which was to make a mass-produced car, not a specialty car, because other people make specialty cars like Ferraris and other low-number types of automobiles, but to make one that was going to hopefully compete with the big three was something that was unthinkable. But John had big aspirations, and he was prepared to do it.
Here's a man who has it made, working for one of the largest automobile manufacturers in the world, and he quits not only to build a different kind of automobile, but a different kind of company. He wanted to make a sports car, relatively inexpensive, that would last for years. And he wanted the company to be the ethical car company.
He brings in Bill Collins, one of the other engineers at GM that he had designed the GTO with. And between the two of them, they decide they're going to make this car. Giorgetto Giugiaro in Italy, one of the most famous Italian designers at the time, is going to pen it.
Giorgetto Giugiaro. What a beautiful name for a talented guy.
He's most famous for a lot of his wedge designs from the mid-'80s, the BMW M1, the DeLorean, the Lotus Esprit. And the only parameters that they set forth were the fact that it had to have stainless steel skin, going doors, and be mid-engine. Those were the parameters.
Giugiaro pins this shape for the car, which is super, super clean. It looks sporty and lithe and fast and sleek and handsome. The windshield's laid back, it's true, but the body sides slope in at the top. We call it tumble home, and that keeps that car from looking boxy. And then when you come down to the bottom of the windows, there's this beautiful shape as the body kind of returns and begins to curve under there. The back hardly tapers at all, it just gets kind of cut off. Kind of a square front end, it's not some weenie front end.
It looked futuristic with the gullwing doors, which in reality is actually a beautiful design. Most people are confused with them. They think that it takes a lot of space, but in reality it requires less space to open a gullwing door than it does a conventional door.
The door itself, as you can see, it comes out 14 inches at its widest point. It's a little deceptive, but that's all that comes out. So it's actually a lot easier to get out of this car in a parking lot than it is a regular car if you have somebody real close to you.
Comes back with this amazing design, and they make the first prototype, Proto 1, made in 1975. And then in 1976, that's when they start raising money using the car as sort of a sales tool. The automotive press and the world reacted super positively to this car because they were excited about the prospect of what it meant. It was this sexy car, it had great fuel economy, but it also was very sporty. The automotive industry in the 70s when John left GM was pretty stagnant. Most automotive makers, other than the ones coming from Japan, weren't necessarily coming out with the most exciting things. For anyone to even think about, not even try, but to think about making their own mass-produced car at that point was insane.
The DeLorean. Gull-wing doors rise effortlessly, beckoning you inside. The sleek, stainless steel DeLorean. Beautifully crafted for long life. The DeLorean is one of the most awaited automobiles in automotive history. Drive the DeLorean. Live the dream today.
It's a brave kind of design language for a car. Brave decision to make it out of stainless. Brave to make it gull-wing. Brave to make a sports car with a motor in the back, no matter what Porsche says, you know. When I was in school, as a car designer, everyone was talking about it. We're all looking at that and saying, this guy is such an individual, and whether or not you thought his choices would sell, you knew that he was just pursuing a dream, and for that, everyone admired him. You wanted to see him succeed. John DeLorean designed that car with many features which people never expected to see on a sports car, right?
The original prototype was supposed to have airbags, anti-lock brakes, all these revolutionary things that none of the cars had in those days. So that was the onset of what he was hoping to accomplish with the car. Now, what ended up being produced was a different car than what the prototype sort of sold, but they take the prototype out, they start raising the financing, and they start looking at various states. The intent was to hopefully make it in the US. There were no real states that were offering the types of tax breaks and incentives that would make it feasible to sort of launch this car division. Then all of a sudden, in the late 70s, he gets a deal struck with Northern Ireland and the UK to build the car in war-torn Belfast, of all places.
The army's role in Northern Ireland is to keep the peace between the Catholics and the Protestants.
Ambushes, sectarian killings, ferocious gun battles across the border.
You gotta understand, Northern Ireland, late 70s, it's just a war zone. 40% of unemployment based on all the war that was happening there between the Protestants and the Catholics. Their interest was trying to find businesses to come there so they could get people employed. More people employed, probably less people in the streets fighting. All of a sudden, they see this white knight in the 6'4", silver-haired John DeLorean with this magical car who said that within 2.5 years, I can produce 3,000 jobs, and then within a few more years after that, probably another 3,000 jobs. Because at the end of the day, the point was not to just have the sports car. There was going to be other cars. He was trying to build an actual DeLorean motor company, not just a one-off. They basically give him everything he wants. They strike the deal in less than 3 weeks, which is incredible.
They offered him just kind of point blank, here's $150 million, here's a piece of land, please come here and build your car. And they didn't really do a lot of investigation and really checking on it too much before they did it. They just wanted a major car company in their country.
They build this factory in 2.5 years, record time, on a total greenfield, state-of-the-art factory. The moment John signed that deal with Northern Ireland, he was already in trouble. That was for a few reasons. They didn't have a productionized car at that point. They had a prototype, and prototypes look beautiful on the outside and to the touch, but in terms of being able to go take it on a track or give it to 10,000 people, there was a hell of a lot more engineering that needed to go into the car.
Seems like you got a lot of unanswered questions for a car that's about to go into production.
No, we're talking about having quite a few months here yet to resolve some of those things.
It was kind of an oh shit moment where, okay, I've been talking about building this car for all these years, now I actually have to go do it. They brought on Lotus and a guy named Colin Chapman, who was also in the UK, to help them productionize the car. And in doing so, the guts of the car completely change. No airbag, no anti-lock brakes, no longer a mid-engine car, but a rear-engine car, which completely changes the car from being a true sports contending car and more of a sort of touring automobile. Obviously, the engine changed. It's a sports car, it looks like it should be going fast, but they used a pretty anemic engine. The reason that ended up happening was, even back then, there were so many rules and laws in terms of getting approvals from the US transportation to have your cars be street legal. They basically used a Peugeot Renault Volvo engine that had already been approved for the US market and were in other cars, with the anticipation that they would be turbocharging that engine within a year or two of the car's release, which really would have given it the sort of performance numbers that it deserved. The only thing John wouldn't let them touch is the stainless steel skin and the gull-wing doors, because he's a marketer and he knew that sexiness was going to sell the car.
He knew he wanted it done in stainless. He was going to offer a lifetime warranty on the body. Of course, I think a lot of bean counters talked him out of that, but he wanted something that was going to last a long time and he was willing to put a warranty on it. And looking at all the DeLoreans today, he would have been just fine doing a lifetime warranty on the body panel.
I have friends that have 500,000 miles on their cars, and the car looks like it just rolled off the showroom. I mean, the stainless steel you can clean with a Brillo pad and Windex, and it looks beautiful. So I think that's a major testament to the car's design. They wanted to make it in a way that was going to be super ethical. So the stainless steel was the outer layer, but underneath the layer they were working on a composite technology, and it was supposed to help with safety, and then it was also supposed to be extremely light. But it was such brand new technology that they were several years away from being able to truly implement it into being a production car. Thus, the switch to the Very technique, which is the technique being used by Lotus to make their cars, which was also like a stamped foam sort of plastic material that the car was made out of and the color was baked into. In the DeLorean's case, they basically used that sort of underbody shell, and then they just put the stainless steel on the outside to dress it up. They did something that no other automotive maker had done at that point. They were making the factory in tandem with engineering the car, in tandem with designing the parts for the car. All so they could stick to this sort of 2.5, 3 year time frame that they had promised the British government that they would be up and running with jobs. What they pulled off was an amazing feat. Everything's in place, he's hiring the best people. He really brought in the dream team of an international team to productionize and make the car. But there's so many elements that go into making and selling a car of this nature and at the volume that he wanted to sell, which was 30, 40,000 cars a year. By late 1980, the first cars start getting produced, and the first one rolls off in January of 1981. And he was hoping that there was going to be basically 30 or 40,000 pre-sales at the door once they started coming out. Well, the early 80s recession hit. Terrible, terrible weather in 1981 when the car debuted.
All of the Midwest was hit with severe snowstorms They couldn't get the cars to the dealers that they promised. So we're talking about half the U.S. couldn't get these cars. And he was really depending on those sales to keep the car company going.
Johnny Carson picks up his car. You know, there's a lot of publicity. Sammy Davis Jr. has his car. And a couple thousand cars sell. But you start hearing these reports of, you know, Johnny Carson's car broke down on the highway because the alternator broke, or people are getting locked in the cars because the lock solenoids aren't working correctly.
The fit and finish was not good on the first DeLoreans coming off the line. With that in mind, you know, every DeLorean was built in Ireland, shipped here to the U.S., which went to one of two quality assurance centers. And they were spending countless hours fixing these cars coming over that weren't right, needed fit. You know, later in 81, they got a lot better.
These things were to be expected. It's a brand new car company. Even traditional car companies today have issues with cars that get, you know, first releases. They needed time to work out some of these issues, and they did. But, you know, there's always that first impression, and unfortunately for some buyers, that made a big impact, and they either canceled their pre-order or they canceled the pre-order because of how poorly the economy was at the time. And then it was really a hunt for trying to find that right buyer that had expendable income. Between the recession and the high inflation and the interest rates being where they were, it set the tone off pretty poorly. At the time that John started talking about this car and wanting to make this car, he wanted to make it accessible to the mass public. So it was supposed to cost $12,000. Was priced at $26,000 to $28,000 in 1982. That's $12,000, $13,000 over what it was supposed to be originally priced when people put their deposits on the car. And so it's kind of the perfect storm of a sort of tough start out of the gate for the DeLorean Motor Company.
John DeLorean, the charismatic former General Motors vice president, is gambling his future on the success of this luxury sports car, the DMC-12.
Now, the problem was he was working on borrowed time. He had to start selling cars right away because his deal with the UK was that he had to continue to get jobs and he had to pay back some of this money that they were giving him. And so a combination of events occur, and he gets painted into this corner, ultimately, where he needs money to keep the company going. Now, he was part of that problem. John was hoping to take the company public, and in doing so, he was trying to make the numbers look great. And so he was upping production at a time period where he should have reduced production to keep a certain reserve in the bank.
Building inventory is not a good, sound business practice in the automobile business. And DeLorean did exactly that last fall.
The public option didn't occur for various other reasons, and all of a sudden he was left with no money and ports full of cars.
I think that was the start of the bleeding out of the DeLorean Motor Company.
The company goes into receivership in early '82, and from that point on, it's a race against time to try and appease the British government into showing them a path forward with other investors putting money into this company. People are starting to get a little weary based on some of the early cars with the quality control. The DeLorean name is being tarnished a little bit in the press. It's not as glowing as it was before. And so to try and get investment at this point from traditional banks and financiers and hedge funds is proving to be difficult. And that's ultimately where he gets trapped. One of John's greatest assets, but also deficiency, was this idea that he could just continue to take risks and not ultimately get hit at the end for taking one of these risks. The last risk he took, which was a very dangerous game of cat and mouse, was this sting operation that he got involved with the cocaine and the US government.
It's a story of big business, big pressure, big money, and the crime of cocaine. It's the story of how and why the FBI caught automaker John Z. DeLorean, and it became a bit clearer today.
The U.S. Attorney's Office here in Los Angeles designed the plan that brought John DeLorean together with William Hetrick, described by authorities as one of California's biggest cocaine dealers.
His quasi-neighbor called him one day out of the blue, who he hadn't spoken to in several years, a guy named Hoffman. And he says, "Hey, I heard you're in trouble. I have some investors that would want to invest in your company." Yeah, it's Colombian guys. They're gonna sell drugs to sort of clean the money through the company. He said, "Listen, I'll do any sort of shady deal as long as the money is coming through a reputable bank. Now, this is where the government gets involved. Hoffman was a paid informant for the US government. He was working off his own bust, and he made a deal with the government to snitch on other drug folks. Now, the problem here is John DeLorean wasn't in the drug business. He was a desperate guy who was trying to save his company, and he got roped into this. Say what you want about it morally versus legally, he wasn't a drug guy. But regardless, he gets looped into this, and the government goes to great lengths to sort of land their big goose, because at the time that this was all going down, Reagan was new in office and he was having a big initiative on a war on drugs. The FBI's mandate was, we need a big bust. And all of a sudden, John DeLorean falls in their laps and they're off to the races. The first part of the scheme is get John to give us $2 million to invest in the drugs, and that's how we'll nab him. Well, John didn't have $2 million. And so the government comes back and says, well, you can give us collateral in the form of $2 million. So John, in his typical sneaky way, gives them collateral, but it's basically fake collateral. It's stocks and it's VIN numbers to cars that the government doesn't even get the titles to. So they take this and they sort of run with it, and their whole case sort of is built around this infamous FBI tape.
On October 19th, in a hotel room in Los Angeles, the trap was sprung on John DeLorean. A suitcase full of cocaine was put before him, and he called it better than gold.
Better than gold? Gold weighs more than that, for God's sakes.
A few minutes later, the FBI arrived, and John DeLorean was put under arrest.
I understand it.
Fred Graham, CBS News, Los Angeles.
You see John toasting with the champagne, saying that, the drugs in front of him is as good as gold, and then he gets busted. Their thought process was a jury of 12 is never going to let this guy off when they see this tape.
The question of entrapment, whether John DeLorean was unlawfully lured by federal agents into committing a crime, is one strategy DeLorean's new attorney will have to tackle.
Howard Weitzman, the amazing attorney, completely demolished the prosecution's case, and John DeLorean was found not guilty.
A cheer went up as John DeLorean left court this afternoon, a free man, acquitted on all charges of cocaine conspiracy. Earlier, as the clerk read the verdict, count 1, not guilty, count 2, not guilty. DeLorean buried his face in his hands and said, praise the Lord. His lawyer said the 12 members of the jury sent a message to the government that its conduct in this case was wrong.
But John DeLorean is still in trouble. Authorities in Britain and the United States want to know what he's done with millions of dollars that were to be used for his ill-fated car factory in Northern Ireland. This week's favorable drug charge ruling may be only the beginning of Mr. DeLorean's legal wrangles.
Although he was found not guilty, DMC, of course, was shuttered by then. By October of 1982, John's busted, and that was the final straw for Margaret Thatcher and the British government to put the axe on DMC. All the employees are let go. The last car comes off the assembly line in November, December of 1982, and that was unfortunately the end of DeLorean Motor Company. John's trials really take over his life at that point, and the drug trial is in 1984. It was a several-year affair, and his name was tarnished, and he had no ability to sort of re-enter the workplace in any meaningful way, unfortunately.
Well, outside of the fact that I've aged about 600 years in the last 2, and that life as a hard-working industrialist has been tattered and torn, I don't know, would you buy a used car from me?
Car was going to be relegated to the scrap heap of automotive history. Little did anyone know.
When they all agreed that the car was going to be converted to a time machine, the very next day, they delivered 3 used DeLoreans to my parking lot.
They made exactly the right choice. Bob Gale made a lot of great choices on that movie.
Finally, we finished the third draft. We had it in, and Universal isn't going to make the movie unless we cut $1 million out of the budget. So Bob and I struggled with how are we going to cut $1 million out of the budget. Well, the time machine was always nuclear powered, whether it was refrigerator or the DeLorean. And the climax of the movie took place at a nuclear test site. So this was going to involve going out to the desert, building one of these little towns that they would blow up to do these tests. So we said, well, this is the most expensive thing in the script, this sequence. Maybe there's a way that we could figure out how to do this on the back lot at Universal where we were already going to shoot. Bob and I walked the town square and we brainstormed and we came up with this idea about harnessing lightning instead of harnessing a nuclear bomb. It turns out sometimes that having some sort of limits on your creativity makes you even more creative, because the clock tower sequence was way better than the nuclear test site sequence could have ever been. Now we were able to hand in a budget that fit Universal's parameters, and we were green-lit. We were able to start hiring more people. Bob Zemeckis hired two of the best people that he got from Romancing the Stone, cinematographer Dean Cundy, fabulous cinematographer, and Alan Silvestri. And there's a reason why Alan has done all Bob's movies ever since, because he's that good. Now here we were finally making the movie. Universal hired a product placement company to make deals to put certain products in the movie that the production would get some money for. Some of the products were picked out by us. For example, you see Pepsi in the movie, but you don't see Coke. Why? Because Pepsi's logo changed from 1955 to 1985, and it was a way of helping to define the period, whereas the Coca-Cola logo remains the same to this very day. But one day the product placement guy comes into my office and he says, hey Bob, if you will change the DeLorean to a Ford Mustang, Ford Motor Company will provide the company $75,000. I said, Richard, Doc Brown doesn't drive a fucking Mustang. Get out of here. Our first production illustrator, Andrew Probert, did a lot of storyboards for many sequences.
My two beginning projects were Battlestar Galactica and Star Trek, and eventually ended up getting a job in Back to the Future.
Even though his job was not to design the DeLorean, he couldn't help himself. He came up with a lot of interesting designs, but what was missing from what he was doing was they were all very slick, very polished. We had this idea that Doc Brown built this thing in his garage, and it had to look earthy, it had to look dangerous. Bob and I had met Ron Cobb while John Milius was doing a movie called Conan. He'd also done some designs for some other science fiction movies.
We talked about working together, so this was an opportunity for that to actually happen. I was kind of bummed that he was the one that was going to design the car instead of me, but I would have nobody else do it besides Ron.
Ron was pretty expensive. We were only able to hire him for a week or two. But in that week or two that Ron was on board, he really focused on it.
It was just a sort of a fun thing that Spielberg just asked me to do one day. How would you make a DeLorean into a time machine? And he pretty much left it up to me, and I just had to concoct some 3-view drawings. And Zemeckis and Gale both came up with the idea of using a DeLorean because of the stainless steel body, and he thought that would be an interesting idea, that because it's stainless steel, it could be turned into a time machine, you know. Beyond that, they didn't have too many suggestions except for the flux capacitor. You know, they wanted something that was kind of visible about that. I just thought that whatever I did had to be fairly visible, so I wanted to do those coils that sort of surrounded it as though creating a field. I mean, obviously no one knows how one travels through time exactly, but I just wanted to create a lot of believable stuff that seemed to put the car in a certain status or something.
He was asking questions and thinking design-wise to say, if the DeLorean is nuclear powered, where's the nuclear reactor? It's got to have one. Where is the cooling vent? All nuclear power plants have to have a cooling vent. There had to be a plutonium chamber. So all these things, Ron said there has to be a logic to this.
I also thought it should look a little bit homemade because Dr. Brown was supposedly doing it in his lab at home, and he would be using parts from Radio Shack or something like that. So I did my version to look like it was all kind of bolted on and added to the DeLorean. I'm always pretty good at adding that stuff, you know, that kind of texture, just something real and complex. I mean, I could never come up with a flux capacitor, though. I tried this, I tried that. I tried a lot of designs, and by the time I was off the project, they still hadn't figured out how it was supposed to look.
The DeLorean would not be what it is without his creative vision and input. So after we couldn't afford to pay Ron anymore, we went back to Andy. We said, okay, Andy,
flesh this out a little more for us. He had his reactor in the back off to one side, and then he had a single exhaust port for that, and the producers thought maybe the reactor back in the middle would have been better with another exhaust port. I felt that the flux bands around the car could have been better arranged to more encompass the car in that field. So I just moved those a little bit, and that was it. And those basically became the working drawings.
And then we had to say, okay, how are we going to translate this into reality?
When it comes down to it, my drawings are just concept art. They're not like blueprints. So there's going to be some wiggle room, some creative input by those who take that off my board and build it.
We've hired our production designer, Larry Paul. Larry, most famous for Blade Runner. And Larry Paul said, there's a guy I know named Mike Fink.
Mike Fink is an amazing man. He was like a tank commander, among other things. He knows everything about everything.
Mike was involved in the vehicle design on Blade Runner. So we brought Mike Fink in.
I got Ron Cobb's designs for the exterior of the DeLorean. They said, we want you to just take care of the DeLorean, make sure it's moving along and getting built right, all that kind of stuff. So I said, okay.
Mike Fink had a very special job, which was running back and forth between Film Tricks, Kevin's shop in North Hollywood, and the studio.
At that time, I had started my company, Film Tricks Incorporated, in North Hollywood. Steven wanted to make sure of the secrecy, and he said, build it in there, don't let anybody take pictures of it. And no sooner had they decided on the DeLoreans in the shop, they came in just like they came from out of time.
How many of these were we going to have? The thing about production cars, they always break down. So we knew we had to have at least two. We decided we would buy 3 DeLoreans.
One was about 18 grand, 15 grand, and 12 grand respectively because of their condition. And we went to work right away. We put them in the shop and started taking them apart and figuring out what we're going to do for designs. And we got sketches.
But they didn't make the sketches looking at a box of parts and numbering them. They didn't make blueprints. They were just some concept sketches.
We got a sense of how busy it was. Look at all the lights they put in these pictures and all the parts, and oh my gosh.
Mike Fink had this job, this amazing job of interpreting the sketches, finding stuff that would kind of look like that they wouldn't have to build from scratch.
You know, I would sit in the car with Kevin and the guys, and I'd say, okay, these go right here, this goes right there, this goes over here.
But then something else came along. So Mike said, I can't do your movie, but I know a guy you should meet.
And I brought in Mike Chaffee, and they met Mike, and Mike and I spent like a week together.
He wanted an assistant. A little before Back to the Future, I had my first TV job, which was doing a self-driving car, and the show was called Knight Rider.
Knight Rider, a shadowy flight into the dangerous world of a man who does not exist.
He called me one day and said, maybe you could spend a day with me and, you know, we could run around and look at stuff because I need someone who knows how things should look, who knows how stuff is built, and who can draw. So we spent a day together. And he said, you know, I've got another show to go on to. So if you'd like my job, you can have my job, but you'll have to be nice with the art department. So that's what got me over there.
And I said, I'm telling you, the guy is brilliant. He's going to be fine. And it was. And Mike did a brilliant job.
Mike was perfect. He had some great credits. So we brought Mike on board.
Mike Fink and Kevin Pike had managed to get that car well underway. I'd never even heard of the movie. So I go into the shop and there's a DeLorean sitting there and it's got the rear hatch off and the back deck off and they're welding up aluminum. And they had some idea of how they wanted the interior to go together as well. They were beginning to position things on the car. It was started, it was rolling.
Mike Chaffee came in and he could figure out what would be the best interpretation of the drawings. In addition to our 20-man crew, we had a wonderful foreman, Dave Wishneck, we had the electronics engineer, Bill Klinger, and they contributed to interpreting what Mike thought should go in the car. Mike didn't put anything on the car, that was our job, and we advised him, well, if you put that there, that'll cause a consequence with this over here, and this won't fit, and how can we do that? And together, they helped to construct what is the DeLorean time machine. We started building, manufacturing, and coming up with parts that looked something like was in the sketches or would convey the idea. It had to be very, very busy. It was a nuclear reactor, so we had to have those kinds of looks and mechanics to it with that big hub in the back where they put in the plutonium. We figured out how to make a latch that would open and close, but the idea about what are we going to do? So then we made these cylinders and then made a little swivel on the bottom that could open up.
There was a little bayonet fitting on the hatch for the plutonium, and it really worked with little pins that engaged in these little slots.
Very visually, it drops that red tube in and everybody thinks, uh-oh, it's ready to go.
And we figured out how to do it with just a lathe and a metal cutting saw and some welding, rather than having to machine the parts, fully with a milling machine or anything like, because it should look like Doc Brown put it together.
Bob Gale came to the shop and said, this is getting too neat. You've got to make this more homemade. Doc Brown did this in his lab, and we went back over the welds and made them a little thicker and fatter and exposed more of the homemade element to it and everywhere we could.
We really tiptoed around any kind of fabrication work, try to keep the build it from scratch stuff to a minimum because it's really time consuming. But the guys there, they were capable of doing anything. Mostly it was putting junk on the car kind of work.
Wait a minute, what are you doing, Doc?
I need fuel. Mr. Fusion, that's 100% Chaffee.
They asked me if I could design a Mr. Fusion. I knew part of it should look like something to do with coffee, because Mr. Coffee. So that's why I used that little Krupp's coffee grinder to make Mr. Fusion.
The practical question was, where are we going to get these parts? And so there's a place in North Hollywood, I believe, where everybody goes to get old aircraft parts, scientific parts.
Apex Surplus Electronics. You could find anything you want there.
Mike went out there and just said, this would look cool, this would look cool. And he started picking this and this and this and this.
It was like an expedition, really, sometimes, to go up to Apex. They have stacks and stacks of stuff. You'd say, oh, I need some of this and some of that. And Steve would say, what are you guys building? What are you building? Because there's all this crazy stuff that we would buy. There are a lot of little Easter eggs in there. Things you'll recognize if you're a car guy, like the Dodge Polara wheel cover. Things you'll recognize if you've worked on a turbine engine. There's a big switch which has for its handle a battery post cleaner. But why wouldn't Dr. Brown use it, right? Half the junk I chose was stuff that I couldn't identify, because I figured if I didn't know what it was, no one would know what it was. And then it wouldn't be like a red flag to people watching the movie, like, oh, that's so silly, look at that. It should all look a little believable. I was hoping to find a gauge for the plutonium chamber, and I ran across a Röntgen meter that measures radiation. It's like, how perfect is this? Because I would leave the part of the meter that says Röntgens, but then put a Doc Brown label, Dymo label underneath it that says plutonium chamber, Doing a car like the DeLorean is a delicate thing because it's supposed to look goofy. There's this professor type, and everything he's invented has been a failure. Part of the movie is just that setup, like failure after failure, the brainwave analyzer, all that crazy stuff that he does. So you're prepared for this thing not to work. And it's got to look like a crackpot to put it together, but it has to look like a crackpot who really knew how to build things, put it together, right? So it's a delicate line. It has to look silly enough that you go, oh, come on. And it has to look believable enough that you say, yeah, maybe. So it really had a little bit of depth. You could kind of look down through the layers and still see the car. So it's a great case of doing design work for the movies. This little ring of nozzles here is from a gas turbine engine that they use to power things like helicopters. These are little heat sinks. They're fit onto a big aluminum tube on which is a Dodge Polara wheel cover. These ducts were fabricated in Kevin Pike's shop, Film Tricks, and painted by the standby painter, Lyle Dickey. I think that these are air-oil separators. On a dry sump aircraft engine, you've got to allow some oil to settle out and air to settle out of the oil, so you're not pumping air bubbles through the thing. And there's just sort of a fantastic freestyle combination of hoses in here. The idea being you've got to cool down a nuclear reactor, and that's going to involve a big transfer of heat, so you need some big exhaust for the heat. I grouped things in threes because I had this vague idea that if we suggest that Doc Brown is using three-phase power for this, we might take some people along. Mike Fink had already got these things designed, and Kevin's guys were building these. when I first came on board the show. The idea is that you have big connectors, a lot of power flowing through here to generate a powerful field. And these connectors here, these are actually for what they call a, oh look, Michael proofed it. They're for what they call a spider box. These are the kind of connections you see on a movie set when you're running big, powerful lights. This is also, it's before GPS. So Doc, being the careful guy that he is, puts a little compass in there. And out of his concern for the passenger, he also has this warning about shielding your eyes from the light, which I love. Originally, Ron Cobb had drawn this with a great deal of stuff between the driver and the passenger. And Andy did some sketches where he began to open that up. Because if you've got like a choker shot on one person, you can get away with that. But if you want a two-shot, or you want to shoot through the side of the car like this, you absolutely have to have an open path here for the camera to see through.
When you have that many people trying to manufacture something and where it goes, you're on top of each other. You can't only put two people in the interior. And think about working upside down and overhead and backwards behind you. It was cramped quarters.
One of the surprises that we had was how small the DeLorean really was. It was so small that we could not fit a Panaflex camera in there. So one of those three DeLoreans had to actually literally be cut apart so that we could situate a camera there to do the through the windshield shots.
For the first movie, there were three cars, the A car, the hero car.
That got all the bells and whistles. Full tilt. B car, we put everything on the outside. They're just going to use it for driving shots. They're going to use it for stunts. They're never going to see inside the car. That lasted until the second day of shooting. Can you put everything in the A car and the B car? We got Polaroids from the set still man. And we try to remember exactly what we did. Okay, we can replicate that, we can replicate that.
The B car had a little bit less detailing, but it really is as good as the A car for the most part. And the B car was rigged for special stunts. It had the fire for when the car's going up the speed that it would light up the wheels. The C car, they cut that car up, and that car was used in all three films. That's so they could put the camera in the car and everything.
The C car was the process car. We don't need any of this stuff, we don't need any of that stuff, but we do need the interiors. We do need to see all the dash, everything in there. But it was on the stage, it was on the rockers, it was front of rear screen, but it was basically something that you could tow around, and it was like a half a DeLorean.
The other shock that we had was when we looked inside the DeLorean, speedometer only went up to 85 miles per hour. No car manufactured in the 80s had a speedometer that went above 85 miles per hour. So we created a new template and put it in there. Anybody that goes and looks inside of a real DeLorean will see that the speedometer only goes up to 85. We started shooting in November of 1984.
Action!
Worked in there from October all the way up to Christmas, and we had pretty much all the cars ready for shooting around the horn of the new year in January, and then we were off to the races. We had one of the nicest stunt teams that I've worked with, Walter Scott. Him and his crew came over, they went through it. Well, it's kind of funky in the front, it bites, and the shocks were, of course, very small pancakes.
The car was totally underpowered. The car had a 6-cylinder Volvo engine. The weight of the car was extraordinary. Everybody was always complaining about the DeLorean for one reason or another. The visibility in it wasn't great. The actors were hitting their head on the door all the time. The special effects didn't always work the way we thought they were going to work.
There was times when rain came about, and the way that we took out the back window, that water could go down and hit the battery. And so all of a sudden the battery was dead. The vents on the back, they actually encapsulated the trunk deck by hugging that valance that's on the back over the lights. That every time you had to get to the engine, you had to take all those off to lift the deck lid, or we had to take them off at night to leave them for the mechanics to do some tune-ups and work like that. We had a set of mechanics from the Teamster department. They had a full truck of every part for that car that they could need if they had to replace it.
There was always some issue with it. Remember, this is 1984. We don't have the technology that we have today, which is, you just put some LED lights in there and tiny little battery and boom, they light up. No, we had to have all these wires coming out of the back, all kinds of equipment to make those time displays light up. All those lights had to be on their own circuits.
There was an onboard transformer on the car, so they were running 9,000 volts to the neon tubes. So on like a wet morning, it was really exciting to be around that car, just crackling and buzzing, you know?
I remember the first time I saw the DeLorean time machine was actually in the parking lot of Puente Hills Mall, and they rolled it out. I saw it just like in the movie. It's rolled out of the back of the van, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was amazing. It was such an audacious, insane idea, and it worked so beautifully. And what was really fun though was when we finished the take, I mean, conventionally you'd get out of the car and let the teamster get in and take it back to one, and then you'd get in and drive it, do the take again. But I got pretty professional with it. Let me just take it back to one myself. I back it up quickly in the spot.
We thought it was interesting that the car would be hot and then it would be cold. So the dry ice effect, when it became cold, and we milked that in the Twin Pines Mall scene, we kind of didn't do much with that after that. But the fire effects were always important because the idea that it left a trail. And Kevin and his guys came up with this stuff that I think they called Go Juice.
We came up with a great chemical that didn't have a high temperature, and it marvelously went from the orange flame when it's hot to the cool alcohol look when it was done.
They would pour the stuff on the ground and then light it up and start shooting, and the stuff would burn for 35 or 45 seconds, long enough for us to get a take.
You'll be seeing this face everywhere you look this summer. Everyone's trying to cash in on the latest star.
We had kids lined up 7 deep to try to catch a glimpse of Michael J. Fox. Bob and I looked at each other and said, man, he really is a big star. That was the first inkling that we had that it was going to be more than just a movie that came and went.
He's an absolute dream.
You know, if you have a crush on someone, maybe you send them a note or something, you're waiting for the reply, you hardly dare look in the mailbox because there's so much riding on it, right? And that's how it is to work on a movie that you have hopes for. You can hardly bear to wait till the thing comes out because it's not up to you. Let's say you're doing props for a movie. What is up to you? Story? Acting? Editing? Music? Nothing. Nothing. You're making props for a show. You're just kind of hoping. And you can't afford to hope too much because it's foolish. You can't allow your satisfaction to depend on what's going to happen at box office. I remember going to the screening, like cast and crew, and just thinking, oh my God, they really pulled it together. It turned out better than we even hoped.
Back to the Future becomes the biggest hit movie of 1985. Plays, in fact, all the way into 1986 in theaters. Studio, of course, wanted a sequel. We weren't so sure about a sequel. Well, the movie made so much money that Sid Sheinberg came to us and he said, gentlemen, Universal is making Back to the Future Part 2. You can either get on that train or not get on that train, but we're making it one way or another. We would much appreciate it if you guys would drive that train.
Well, we're going, we don't need roads.
So by the time we were into production on the sequels, we had 7 DeLoreans.
Each car from the first movie was used in all 3 movies. The A car was usually for first unit work. B car was more stunt, second unit work, although sometimes it was used first unit. And the C car was used all throughout. Then they built a fiberglass car that they could hang from a crane, and they would use on a forklift and everything. For the third movie, they introduced 2 new cars that were built on modified DeLorean frames with sandrail frames. They took the DeLorean frame in the middle, cut it up, put this other suspension on, which is basically Volkswagen. So they had these 2 cars that were made to go on the desert scenes. The B car from the first movie was modified to be on the rail tracks, and then they built a second rail car, which was designed to do the stunt with the wheelie and everything.
By the time we were halfway through the production of the third movie, we were busting up some of these cars pretty significantly. I recall that we took one car and decided we're just going to use this car for parts.
The first show was completely different than the second and third. 27 people in the art department on part 2. Part 1, we were on a shoestring, let's just do it. We have no time, let's get this thing done. But the sequels were a totally different experience. They had 5-time visual effects Oscar winner Ken Ralston down here with a new piece of hardware no one had ever seen before, the Tondro.
The computer memorizes every nuance of that camera move and plays it back exactly the same way every time. It allows us to have one actor play multiple roles in the same shot, but not have to have the camera locked down like they used to have to do in the old movies.
When it came time to hit the car with the train at the end of the third movie. It was important to destroy the car for a couple of reasons. One, not the least of which was nobody thought we would ever do something like that. The audience reaction the first time we screened the movie, I mean, it was like an old friend being killed, right? It was great. I mean, in terms of the emotional investment that the audience had in the DeLorean. We had to destroy the car because you just wanted to say, okay, this is done. We can't use the car to go back in time anymore. We're putting a period on this. At this point, of course, we really had decided that we weren't going to do a fourth movie. We wanted to make that really clear. Well, why don't you guys do a part 4? Creatively, there's nothing left that we needed to say about these characters. We're done. We've seen too many movies where they make one too many sequels, two too many sequels. We had a story to tell, and we told it, and the story has a wonderful ending, and that's a good way to go out. After we finished Part 3, Universal took possession of all the cars. It's their money, it's their property.
The fiberglass DeLorean replica was put on the cinematic display at Universal Studios Hollywood, and after many years was reported destroyed. The Oxnard car was a dedicated stunt car. After filming of Part 3, the car was used for some of the filming of the ride, and then it was put on display at Universal Studios Florida. It's gone into various decay, and right now it's just in storage. For the scenes that were filmed at Monument Valley, they made 2 dune buggy cars. One was bought by 2 private collectors and was restored and then sold at auction. The other car was used as a parts car. They took parts off this car and put them on other cars such as the C car. At the end of filming, it looked like a wreck. However, after filming Part 3, they actually put just DeLorean panels on it and put it in a second cinemagic display so people could see it. And when it came time for Universal Studios Japan to open a ride, they took parts of this car and the C car and made a replica time machine. The C car was left in storage, and then eventually they put it outside where it was left to the elements. The car was used to actually build a replica car for Universal Japan. The B car was the sacrificial lamb. It was the one that they rigged with explosives and was hit by the train. This car lives on in various other cars. Jay Orberg, who built promotional cars, used parts of this to make his promotional tour cars, and then he even took the panels and put them together for Planet Hollywood at their Hawaii restaurant. It's now currently in Bill and Patrick Shea's collection.
The A car went on display at the Universal Tour in California.
They filmed the ride with it. They used it for an Earth Day special for CBS.
Great Scott!
They used the A car in the cartoons for some of the beginning of the shows. They had live action stuff with Christopher Lloyd. And then it was just used all around the studio. It was an attraction. They would take it to events. They would do this and that. Eventually, though, it would just sit outside.
I have found over the years that the people that have DeLoreans either have them because of the movie or they have kept them because of the movie. Now, people have gone beyond to make their DeLoreans as screen exact replicas as possible. Some people do it themselves, some people get some extra help.
I was 10 and I saw that car and I was like, that's the car. That's the car of my dreams.
Once I started, I found this whole community of other builders out there. People who had already done work, people who were doing work alongside each other. And you know, in the early days, it was great because everyone would just share with each other. And it just became like a family of like-minded, crazy people. I'm like, oh, you're my people.
I think there's probably a handful of people that get pissed off about the people that make the Back to the Future cars out of regular DeLoreans because they feel like it's sacrilege to be damaging the car in that way. But there are also a lot of ways to do it where you can reverse it and it doesn't mess up the car.
The first one took me about 4 years to build, to restore the car completely and to do all the Back to the Future stuff. So I just started little by little recreating the parts as I could and putting them on my car. And my first one, I think, was the absolute funnest car I ever built. I'm working on number 20 right now of complete cars. But now I'm doing it for everybody else that wants to done. I build a lot of parts for guys that are doing it themselves in their garage. So I probably have my hand in at least 100 of the DeLoreans out there some way or another. There's a part on there that I've probably built or had my hands on.
Let's keep in mind, those are toys. Those cars were never meant to carry that much weight. You're not going to use them as a daily driver.
It was nuts enough driving a DeLorean around, but when you're driving the car as the time machine down the road, people lose their mind.
Dude, you gotta stop right now.
and it's actually quite dangerous for the driver because they're not trying to run you off the road. They pull up next to you, they want to take pictures, they're giving you thumbs up, they pull in front of you, and they want to take So right off the bat, I was like, I don't think we can drive this thing anymore.
We have been stopped by all the finest law enforcement officers all over the world who wanted to check our paperwork and make sure that everything was in order.
I had my car on a flatbed and people have followed it. One guy got out and was crying, like legitimately. He's like, I never thought I would get to see this in real life. And there is something emotional about it because of this film, because of all the things that work in the film, the story, the characters, the music, all those things. When we see the car, that is a symbol of that moment, what they felt and what they feel when they watch it and rewatch it and rewatch it.
Well, I've ended up building my own DeLorean time machine replica, and there's a lot of stuff that, as someone that knows so much about it, I know it's not super accurate, but, I'm happy with how it looks and how it makes me feel. There's stuff I did on my car that was specific to a certain scene in part 2, because in my mind, that's what I wanted to build. There's wirings that's wrong in any other part, but that's how I wanted it to be. There's a very rabid interest in these movies and the car and everything, and it's a good thing. The only thing is sometimes I think that people get so involved, they forget the real thing is what was on the screen. We're all fans, and if people realize that there's not some big trophy at the end for being the biggest fan, then there's room for everyone,
We don't go after anybody that makes a Back to the Future DeLorean, even if it's not a great one, because you are all ambassadors for the film. Because people see a DeLorean even if there's not a Back to the Future modification in it at all. And it makes them smile, and it makes them think about the movie. And that's great. When people have gone the extra mile to put a flux capacitor and time displays in it, God bless you. We love you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
It's a compliment, and I love seeing them, and I love talking to them when we go to the conventions. They're just full of joy and full of questions, and I'm happy to help.
I know how much work it takes. I know those people are building those cars in their unair-conditioned garages. I know they're taking money that could have gone to something else. Honey, trust me, this is going to be so cool. They have a dream, just like DeLorean had a dream. Just like Doc and Marty, they have a dream. If not for the afterlife of the movie, I never would have met the Haulers. Two amazing people who decided to build like a folk art DeLorean and just put stuff on the car so it looked kind of like the movie.
We were one of the first. We weren't the first, but it was early on.
August 4th, 2000. Oliver wakes up from sleep and he's in horrific pain. His brother and I rush him to the hospital and he's diagnosed with cancer.
I had a tumor the size of a football. Doctors came from other operating rooms just to see it.
We're told that he has cancer and he has 6 months to live, which we had to say what?
When you get news like that, you take care of business. You put your house in order.
When he was given his diagnosis, there was no chemo program and no radiation program that fit his situation. It was hopeless. It was the end. And that's what we had to face.
But they said we'd like to monitor the progress of the disease. A friend of ours helped us make a will. Not that we had much to pass on to anybody, but you kind of get the legal parts.
When you're in your
order.
30s, you don't expect this. Yeah. So getting our lives in order was very important to us. And we sat with our minister and he said, well, what do you want to do? And pretty much at lunch that day, Oliver said, I really want to build a time machine. Looking at me, I'm like, okay. If we only have 6 months, let's have the most fun we can have. What would that be? Because to dwell on it wasn't going to help anybody. We had to watch a videotape
of the movie
on a 20-inch, we thought, big screen, and pause it and try to figure out what the parts were, what the words were.
We live in more of the spirit of Michael Chaffee, hey, does this look good? Does this work? Does this fit? Yeah, that looks pretty good. We used our imaginations, and we would go to salvage surplus places, old electronics junk shops, scrap metal yards, and we'd have kind of a list I would draw pictures of what I would see on the TV. So I'm like, okay, we need a box of like this big, and it needs to be gray, and it has to have a window in it. So she'd be on aisle 4, in this pile of junk. She'd be like, I think I got it. And she will have dug out of this big pile of stuff a box about that size. It wasn't gray.
No, it was bright yellow, and
yellow.
it didn't have a window, but it had the right latching, and the size was good.
Yeah, and I'm like, well, we can paint it, and we can cut out a hole and put a window in it. But the most important part was, how much was it?
$10.
$10 for a flux capacitor. So that fit our budget. The more you learn in a process like this, like building a time machine, the more you become yourself. You're becoming more of you. You're working through problems and coming up with solutions. And I was like a honeybee with the car, and I would be working on the front end, and I was like, I don't know how to attach this. I don't know how I'm going to integrate this in. So I'd be like, oh well, it'll come to me. And I'd go to the back of the car, and I'd work on something that I did know how to do. And then in the middle of the night, I'd wake up with the answer, and I'd be like, I got it.
All right
And
then.
you'd be like, good, go
Write
back
it
to
down.
sleep.
Go to sleep.
And I worked night and day, 3.5 months solid, out in the driveway. We don't have a garage. So I would go back and forth, and I killed the grass between the car and my little workshop, making little things, carrying it back to the car, fitting it, shaving off a little bit to make it fit better. And again, I was just driven. I didn't get tired. And I just knew the whole time it was going to work out. I had faith. This is going to be a time machine. Soon. I'm going to get this done.
And once it was accomplished, my request to Oliver was, please don't let it sit in the driveway. So it didn't. We drove it around. And what we found driving it around, any stop we made, people wanted to see it. We were finding dollar bills stuck under our windshield. So if the car was in the parking lot alone, we were in the restaurant eating or seeing a movie, we'd find these dollars around.
Or a little love letter. We found little letters saying, you made my day. The car would get such a wonderful reception anywhere and everywhere we went. And we realized, gee, we're not the only ones that are enthusiastic about this. And we thought, well, if we could relate their enthusiasm towards something useful, we might be able to accomplish something. So about the same time we were building the car, Debbie Brooks sat down with Michael J. Fox, and they were building the Michael J. Fox Foundation for Parkinson's Research.
They're the world's largest funder of Parkinson's research next to the U.S. government.
We kind of just started putting our efforts towards supporting them.
He'd see the doctor, started at 3 months, the next 3 months, the next 3 months, the next 3 months. So let's go to every 6 months. So the next 3 or 4 years was every 6 months.
After about 5 years of this, he said, Oliver, I don't want to see you anymore. You've shown very poor progress of the cancer. And I said, well, likewise, and
Thanks,
see you later.
It's been said by a few people, but most touchingly by Bob Gale, that maybe the car, maybe having that focus on something else saved his life.
To give something back, Oliver and Terry now take this DeLorean all around the world. They have a collection box built into the car, and it all goes to Michael's foundation, and they're just wonderful people.
They've driven hundreds of thousands of miles around the world supporting Michael J. Fox's foundation. There's everything good about people in that story. Have the dream, put in the effort, do something good, makes everyone's lives better. It's been an amazing experience to meet the people who are willing to invest that kind of effort.
Our original goal was $1 million.
And to reach all 50 states.
And that is, the 50 states have been accomplished. The mileage on the vehicle after being driven in 28 countries is 800, and I just looked, 27,000 miles.
And we've raised just about dollar for dollar the same amount in donations.
So we'll get to that million.
We're going to get to that million soon, I hope. I'm going to tell them a secret. I've never told this secret before. It's the secret to successful time traveling.
Aw, that's sweet. Thanks.
Having a really good adventure buddy.
Okay, you got your teeth.
You got it.
The first time I ever saw the A car was in 1985, and it used to be on display in front of the queue line for the Universal Studios tour. The next time I saw the car was at the premiere for Back to the Future 3 at the Cinerama Dome. And that was literally coming straight off of the production, probably in like 95% completion. I mean, the only thing that was not on the car was Mr. Fusion was not there. So then fast forward to 1997, that was the next time I got to get up close to the car, and it had been missing a few pieces by that point, but it was still in pretty good shape. But you can see that it had been out in the sun for years, and the sun started, wearing away at the car.
It wasn't built with the expectation this is going to outlast the years.
Over time, the car just gets more decrepit, parts go missing. Most of the fandom, including myself, up until about 2008, everyone thought it was a B car. We all thought the A car was like in Steven Spielberg's private collection. Eventually, Nike was having an event. They were doing Nike Air Mags for an auction for Michael J. Fox Foundation.
Nike wanted to do a promotion to create the shoe that was in Back to the Future Part 2. As part of the event that they had to announce this, they had this event at the studio, and they brought the car out. It was a mess. I couldn't believe that they had let it get into such disrepair.
It looked terrible. Stephen Clark was there with Gale, and he was actually there as part of BackToTheFuture.com, and he got pictures, and he was right there at the moment that Gale saw the car there, and that was the moment that the restoration really took foot. Terry had his car at the evening event, and the contrast between the fan car and the original movie car basically laid fruit to the idea of the restoration of the A car.
I was like, hey, rather than hire a restoration company, the fans should restore it. They know this car inside and out. It should go to them. And Bob said, that's a great idea. Why don't you produce the restoration? Why don't you get the guys together? And so I met these guys that were filled with art designers and engineers that were sneaking on the Universal lot at night to study the real car. And then they would forensically, down to the tiniest screw, take down the information so that they can rebuild it back at their house. And they were making the most accurate car. I was like, I want to know those guys. I hired them to put together my car, which became, at the time, one of the most accurate ones in the world. I had a partner, Joe Walser, and we went to Universal, and we brought my car next to the real car. And the execs from the theme park came down, and they were like, oh my God, this is the real car. I mean, there was rats living inside it. It was it was in horrible shape. And that was it. Bob Gale had got us restoration, and literally we took custody of the car, and we just started taking it apart to try and figure out how we were going to fix it. It was this group project of 3 dozen guys of fans that were just giving up hours and hours. There was way too much time.
Joe, of course, Walser will forever be the alpha and omega of this hobby. I've never seen somebody more knowledgeable or dedicated to one car so much in my life.
He handpicked the best time machine builders and the best restoration people that he knew to build the A car.
At this point, Joe knows more about the details of the car. I did that 30-some years ago, right?
When he came to us with the restoration project, we were all just stunned. Like, really? Really? The A car. We're gonna restore the hero A car. Like, yep. I was like, I'm in.
They were saying, hey, we need parts. Do you have any parts? And I said, I do. I said, well, what kind of parts are you looking for? I said, we need, do you have a TRW keypad? That's how they input the time destination. I said, I have 5 of them. And he goes, okay. He says, you got to help us with this car more.
It was a coming together of many different parties, DeLorean mechanics and art departments and engineers, just people who were just appreciated it as a piece of art.
So when we were restoring the A car, the first mandate was get the car restored to a showroom DeLorean. And then once it got to a perfect DeLorean, then we took it from the DeLorean to the time machine.
I remember the first time I spread all the pieces out on the floor. There was a sense of reverence where I just kind of stood over it and I looked at a pile of my childhood on the ground and I'm like, I get to help.
We knew that we had the responsibility of bringing it back, so it wasn't like, oh, you know, like it's not like that. It was more like, okay, we need to get serious, maybe the way a doctor would be when he's going into surgery. You know what I mean? It's just about, okay, let's get to work and save this patient. So as an archivist and a conservator, my mantra is leave it alone. Don't touch it, but unfortunately things deteriorate and break down, so that's when the conservation comes in. It's like, how do we preserve this with the integrity? For example, like the Goodyear tires. Those are the original tires. Well, you can't drive on them. So I was like, let's put an inner tube inside of the original tire. So therefore the inner tube's holding the air. So that's where I think the artistry of conservation comes in. It's like you're looking at the original tire from the movie, but also you've kept the structural integrity to hold the car up. So it looks like it should, but you're not erasing any of the history. And every single thing you do as a conservator, that's the way you approach it all. Every single step on the vehicle was done with lots of discussion. What's the most appropriate way to make this thing look the way that the public wants it to look?
The flux boxes, for example, they were completely beyond repair and had been destroyed over the years. They weren't even worth repairing. We just had to make new ones. So using the ones that came off the car, we do a little bit of prop forensics on the piece. Then I would start building new pieces from scratch. Precision, just really, really paying attention to it, and Joe would come over and be like, tweak this angle, and be okay, we tweak it a little bit. The flux bands, I hate them. I hate them. Everyone hates them because they're hard to do. They're always the hardest part of every build. And you have to bend them by hand in increments. You go back against the car, bend a little bit, check the angle, bend a little bit, and all you gotta do is screw up once and you throw it out, get another bar, start over again.
They had done their homework and their research to extensive levels, you know, and they also had the complete support of Universal. It was very difficult. I mean, it was all-nighters, you know, all-dayers. I mean, anytime we had spare time, we'd be working on this thing, and even some days, it didn't matter if we had other commitments.
And people killing themselves to get it done, but glad to be dying. I've never seen more of a labor of love in my life.
It was exhilarating because you were literally looking at the fingerprints of the production crew who put it together originally. Like you were taking things off that had never been off of a panel since they were put on, like the flux capacitor. And you'd see pencil markings from the crew, and you're like, wow, you have this sense of honor just being anywhere near it. Having said that, it was exhausting. We didn't ask for nearly enough money. We should have asked for easily another $150,000 to do it. Nobody made any money off of it because we just wanted the gig. It was overwhelming.
First class or no class was the mantra that I had in my head. It's like everything has to be perfect. And of course, Joe had that exact same mindset.
Because the restoration was done by the fans, there was a madness for obsession that was something Universal wouldn't. You handed back a car that resembled the DeLorean time machine, they would have been happy because they're like most people would be like, oh yeah, that kind of looks like the thing. This team would obsess about a screw that you couldn't even see, but they knew was under a piece of equipment, and they would try to go find that special screw just because they knew it was there. That was the level of authenticity that was a battle every day. That was the level of accuracy that they went for.
Oh, that's a lot.
There's a lot of drama that follows that community of DeLorean replica people, and it all played big time. When you had the Holy Grail, you know, it was like Treasure of the Sierra Madre, and people went mad.
Personalities clash, and everybody in this hobby are very motivated type A individuals. So, you know, of course, we would occasionally fight like brothers, and then, you know, you make up, go get a pizza, and come back and turn a wrench. I think we all crawled away from the restoration for a couple of years and just needed to hibernate, but absolutely worth every drop of sweat and blood. Your toughest moments, at your tiredest, you would just look back at the car and remember what you're doing. Give some of the magic back to that it gave to us.
We restored it to the nuclear reactor version because that's really the purest version of it. Felt like at that moment it came off the back of Doc's truck.
There's so much, you know, that varies over the films, and sometimes from scene to scene in the original Back to the Future. So like, well, do we do it from this scene or the flux boxes? You know, like debates like that every single day. And, what we came to was sort of an amalgam of the best.
But there is no perfect. And that's why so many people are so unhappy when they get into building their cars. There is no perfect. The car looks the way it should look. It looks like it did rolling off the back of the truck. Personally, I probably would have let a little bit more wear show through. Everyone has their own reasons and points of view with this stuff and how to restore it.
If I was the Universal Studios archivist, I would have said this car stays exactly the way it stays, cracks, blemishes, dings and all, and no one touches it, but that's not the way it happened. The car was left outside and it was so far gone that you couldn't leave it. It was undisplayable by that point. So it had to go through a complete restoration. To me, the car was about the original people who made the car, the original workmanship from the people that built the car.
Would the A car be better if it was just cleaned up and as shell as it was? I don't think so. I think you have to capture the magic.
I'm proud to have that experience. I wouldn't trade it for anything, but I'm so next to it that I see the work that I did and what all the other guys did. And here's the thing I always like to tell people. It's like you can't meet Doc Brown. You cannot meet Marty McFly. They're not real. But the time machine is real. So when you are in the presence of the real A car, it's like you're meeting a character from the Back to the Future films. Unfortunately for me, it's not quite the same again, but that's the trade-off. You get to work with your heroes, it changes things.
I remember it was a silent moment when it was finally done, and we shut the lights off and just sat there and looked at it. For a while, nobody said anything. Nobody said a word. It was like you were in a church. It was incredible.
My God, what a job these guys did.
The Peterson, where the car is on display, has a wonderful display of cars from the movies. You kind of have a little catch in your throat when you see that thing.
Peterson is one of the largest public automotive collections in the world. We're able to allow enthusiasts to see the car in person. The car does not belong to the Peterson, but it's got a permanent home here. A lot of what we tell in that gallery is that symbiotic relationship between science fiction and the automotive industry. Even the gadgets that we use today are inspired by science fiction. It's people's imagination saying, like, what if? And that catalyst eventually turns into something that we have in our pocket every day or something we drive on the road every day. Bob's creation showcased what potential cars have, and we still haven't hit that future, but we might someday.
What I've learned over the years is that we need to depend on the fans to preserve the legacy because they love the movie more than anyone.
Talk about fans, of the movie. They're just so surprising and amazing and supportive. It's a good group to be in.
We are still surprised that it's got these legs, that it has become this classic. That is such a beautiful thing.
It's like literally a part of people's lives, and I love that. One woman came up to me and said, I'm a rocket scientist because I saw the movie and I saw, Doc Brown.
Back to the Future fans have been amazing supporters of the foundation. Amazing. They have events, Back to the Future related events, DeLorean related events, Chairman under the Seat dances, all kinds of stuff. And it's really gratifying to see that I've kind of personally it's touching that they not only love the movie, but they've taken a little bit of our own personal stories into their hearts, and just the fact they think about you and get out and support you means everything.
Kids who saw the movie in 1985, they have their own kids, and they say, hey, I want to show you this movie that I loved when I was a kid. Same way that my parents said, you have to watch The Wizard of Oz. It just is transcending through these different generations.
We were talking to a guy named Tom. He's told his children that it's important for you to watch certain films so that you can function in society and understand the references.
21 gigawatts!
He said, and Back to the Future is certainly a movie that I have shown my children over the years.
It's part of our culture, honestly. It's not just pop culture, it's a huge part of our culture and deserves to be remembered as such. There's so many great films that add art and greatness to people's lives, and that is worth perpetuating so we can keep doing it.
The history of our country is formed by the experiences that all the artists, all the people who are creative have made, and that has influenced the direction that people go.
The idea that the time machine aspect of the car was designed by one guy in his garage. It's a truly American idea. An outcast of society is the visionary that comes up with something that nobody else can come up with. It's a piece of great American folklore, and it's told and retold again in the history of American invention. And so embodied in this car is this extra level of American ingenuity. I mean, it is the dream of any creative person to be involved in something that gets a life of its own.
You know, who knew that would happen with Back to the Future? You hope, because it's kind of like pressed flowers. You know, there's all this stuff of the time in there. The cars that are on the street, what people thought was cool. And it really did stand the test of time. And you don't know at the time whether something's going to be good. And you have to leave it up to people. You leave it up to time to figure that out. That's been an unbelievable privilege just to see that happen, just to be connected with it. I mean, I just worked on some props, but I'm proud to be part of it. You really see the genius of Ron Cobb and Andy in that design. You see the genius of Mike Fink calling out the parts to make it work. You see the genius of those guys in Kevin's shop and their patience. I know what went into making it. I remember those nights and days. And I remember what it was like when they were shooting on location. And I remember the stories that would come back. And I remember the doubt and the hope that people had. I remember how it felt to read that script for the first time, and I'm going, oh my God, this is really good. If I look at the car, I see all of that. I see the corners we cut, and I see the lengths we went to make it right. Everything. There are many feelings I had about the car, how I felt about it when I was a car designer, how I felt about the choice when they made the movie, and then what had happened and what was going on in the press. I don't think they could have chosen better.
The legacy of the DMC-12 is an American dream story.
The car, that stimulated so much of the imagination.
Even though the car was built in Northern Ireland with English engineering and a lot of French and English parts, there was something really American about the whole story, just the nerve that he had. He was such a self-made man.
Me getting to know John later in life, you know, you could see the appreciation that he had from DeLorean owners reaching out to him and the sort of love and admiration that they had for the good things that he did. Because listen, at the end of the day, no one is perfect. We all have our flaws. His just happened to be a little larger than others, but the things he did that were great were a little larger than what maybe others accomplished in life too. That's the part that's the most interesting. I mean, he basically made a car that's like him. It looks sexy on the outside, but there were a lot of deficiencies. That's the word.
Even though he didn't make it through, his car did. And that car needs to be nurtured and valued and seen for what it is.
This car could have just been a footnote in automotive history. It ended up being an icon. And that was because of what the Bobs did by implementing it into one of the greatest sci-fi films ever made.
Bob Zemeckis, Steven Spielberg, and I jointly got a letter from John DeLorean. And John just said, gentlemen, last week I had the occasion to see the movie Back to the Future. I thought it was brilliant, and I am delighted that you selected my vehicle for immortality, something along those lines. The design team on Back to the Future, and he knew who they were. He said Ron Cobb, Michael Chaffee, Andy Probert, and Kevin Pike can all be part of my next design team on my next project. You can't think of Back to the Future without thinking of DeLorean. You can't look at a DeLorean without thinking about Back to the Future. It's just an amazing unification.
It's not like no offense to Star Trek, but it's not like a Starship Enterprise model on your mantelpiece. It's a freaking car that someone dreamed up and made real, and you can turn the key, you can travel in that car.
The Millennium Falcon from Star Wars. You can't see that on the 405, but you can see a DeLorean. You know what I mean? And when you do, you're instantly back there.
You know how you play Star Wars with your buddies? Get some sticks and
lightsabers.
you go pew 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 pew. You don't fight with your Back to the Future friends. It's not a battle. It's not a war. you play.
You just want to protect all those things.
There's no better place for this car than the Peterson. This is where it belongs.
It has a home. It's safe.
It's sort of about future generations and saying, hey, this is special. You know, take care of this because we're all caretakers. It's going to live forever.
This one really works, you see. This one can actually time travel. Nobody believes that, but it really does.
This is something that's worth doing. Santa's sleigh is special because Santa rides it. The Millennium Falcon is special because that's the one that Han Solo flew around. That's why we have all this stuff. That's why we have car museums. It's the people's interaction with cars. The artifact is what it is. The car itself isn't it. It's the whole package. I think that that's what's alluring, is that it's not just a cool car, it's the story that went with it.
It's exciting to have been a part of the movie. It's exciting to have been able to drive that DeLorean, have it take me to the future and beyond. And I'm glad it still takes you places too.